Sorry, Maura, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Okay, we'll start in a second. Um, okay, so we're going to be looking at one of the most famous, I guess, World War I novels of all time, All Quiet on the Western Front. So what I want to do today is tell you something about the author. It's a very interesting fellow, Erich Maria Remarque. Then I'm going to read you a brief piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago, because 2 years ago is the 90th anniversary of the appearance of this novel. And it's a great synopsis, really, a great summary of what the novel is all about. And then we'll start looking at the novel itself. And then we'll probably finish it up on Wednesday, rather Thursday. And then on Tuesday, we'll see the movie version. Movie version is also a very important piece of cinema. It was very well made and enjoyed really a lot of success. But first of all, who was this guy? Erich Maria Remarque. His name actually is quite interesting. You'll see why in a moment. Anyway, Erich Maria Remarque, he was born, his birth name was Erich Paul Remarque. He was born on the 22nd of June, 1898. He died on the 25th of September, 1970. And he was a German novelist of the 20th century. And his landmark work is the one that we're going to be reading beginning today, All Quiet on the Western Front. And you'll hear shortly why it's called All Quiet on the Western Front. And how it got its title and translation, because it's written in German, Westen nichts Neues, the original title, and it was translated by an Australian into English. So his most famous work is this one, All Quiet on the Western Front. It was published in 1928, and basically about the German military experience in World War I. What makes it unique is that you would expect, being a German novel about war, it would be pro-war. It would be very militaristic. No, it's the exact opposite. And it's also considered one of the great pieces of pacifist literature. And it got Remarque into big trouble, as you'll see later on. As I said, he was born in 1898 into a working class Roman Catholic family in the German city of Osnabrück. His father was Peter Franz Remarque and his mother Anna Maria Stallknecht Remarque. He was the third of four children. His other sibling, he had an older sister, Erna, a brother Theodor, but Theodor Arthur, who died actually at the age of 5, and a younger sister, Elfriede. And you'll see why the siblings play a role also. But first, let me, no pun intended, let me remark about his name. You'll notice how it's spelled, Remarque. Doesn't sound very German, right? It sounds more French. And indeed, his grandfather came from France. He was a Huguenot. I don't know whether you know anything about the Huguenots. They were Protestants, and they were persecuted in France, because France was a predominantly Catholic country. So many of them left. And they came, believe it or not, to Germany, especially to Berlin, which was a much more tolerant atmosphere. As a footnote, it should be noted that during World War II, when Jews and others were being persecuted by the Nazi government, there were still many Huguenots in France. And there was a whole subculture or underground that was getting Jews, French Jews. France was occupied in World War II. Northern France was occupied by Nazi Germany, and southern France was the Vichy government, which was a collaborationist government with the Nazis. So the Huguenots in France actually set up a system whereby they hid Jews in the mountainous areas of France, in basically in recognition of the fact that they knew historically what it means to be a persecuted nation. So anyway, his grandfather, Erich Maria Remarque's grandfather, came from France. He was a Huguenot, hence the French spelling. But Remarque's father changed the spelling to Remarque, R-E-M-A-R-K, to make it more German. His son, Erich Maria, reverted to the French spelling. What's interesting about the German spelling, R-E-M-A-R-K, when the Nazis came into power, one of the books that was burned right away was Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, plus everything else he wrote. And the Nazis claimed, this is absurd, but the Nazis claimed that Remarque was Jewish. Why? They said that his name really was R-E-M-A-R-K, which if you read it backwards, spells Kramer, K-R-A-M-E-R. And they said, well, that's a Jewish name, and they were trying to hide the fact that they were Jewish. Absolutely absurd, like every other absurdity of the Nazis. It was French. The name was Remarque. So that sort of explains something about his name. During World War I, that's what we're talking about, Remarque was conscripted into the German Imperial Army. He was then 18 years old. And in June of 1917, he was transferred to the Western Front. And he served there until the end of the war. After the war, he went back to his original career of teaching. He was a teacher. And he worked in a primary school in a small town in Germany, Lohne. And now it's now in a different county, county of Bentheim. From May of 1920, he worked in Kleinbersen in another German county, Hörmling, which is now Nana, and then he ended up where he'd been born to begin with, in Osnabrück. He also was a paid writer for certain newspapers. He was a librarian. At some point, he was a journalist. He was also an editor. But his first attempt at writing was when he was 16 years old, actually. He wrote a book called The Dream Room, Traumbude. But after he came back from World War I, like most World War I writers, I mean, obviously he was greatly affected by what he saw. And he published a novel called Station am Horizont, Station at the Horizon. And then he, of course, wrote the famous All Quiet on the Western Front, Im Westen nichts Neues, in the original German. And that novel, as you saw, I hope you started reading it, is about the experiences of a group of young boys of gymnasium age, which is the equivalent really of high school, really young, who go off to fight in World War I. In the movie version begins much more dramatically. In the movie version, they're sitting in the classroom, and the teacher in the front of the room, of a certain vintage, has been around for a while, actually fought in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. So he's full of this patriotic fervor and nationalism and everything else, and he encourages these students of his to go sign up and go off to fight for the fatherland. And he gives them this rousing speech, and of course, most of them are moved by the speech. The ones that aren't are hesitant, are sort of egged on by their classmates. And one guy in particular, it's a very sad story, he really doesn't want to go. He's afraid, as well he should be. And you can imagine what his fate is in the novel. He's the first one to be killed. In fact, they're all killed by the time the novel ends. And The main character in that respect is a guy by the name of Paul Boehmer. He is the really the spokesman. He's really the most intelligent of all of them, the most mature, and the most insightful. So he's really the chronicler of this whole story and the fate of his classmates as one by one they're cut down. And then, of course, the end of, well, I don't want to kill it all, but the last scene in the novel is a very poignant one. It shows how Paul, is killed, but it's just, loaded with meaning. In the movie version, there's an add-on. He dies the way he dies in the novel, but then there's another scene sort of added on in the movie version, which we'll talk about. It's also really quite amazing. And it, I think, is connected to the most famous poem of World War I, which we're going to be reading in Flanders Field. And I'll explain what I think the connection is. But this novel is really what made him famous. And there was a sequel to it, The Road Back. It's another World War I novel by Remarque, and it shows post-World War I. He died, Remarque, at the age of 72 in Locarno, Switzerland. And he's buried in Switzerland, and there's a very good reason why he's not in Germany. You'll see why. Anyway, about his personal life, he was married twice, and his first wife was an actress, Ilse Jutta Zombona. They married in 1925. It was a difficult marriage, to say the least. A lot of philandering on both sides and whatever. So 5 years later, they were divorced. But then he married again. And the second marriage, Pauline Goddard, was a very successful marriage. And interestingly, if you're sort of interested in the history of theater or the life of Remarque, Goddard, Pauline Goddard was an actress. And before she died, she left a will, and she left all of her papers and all of her husband's, Remarque's papers, to NYU. So they're in an archive down in the village at New York University. What's interesting is the following about his experiences in the post-World War I era, and a horrible story. So as I said, this was a great anti-war novel. Needless to say, when the Nazis came into power, anti-war was not exactly, at the top of their list, quite the contrary. And on top of that, the Germans in the Hitler era were very much focused on World War I for a couple of reasons. But the most important was the symbolism, because the Germans believed, and the truth is, there is some merit, everything has sort of a grain of truth. They believed, the Germans, that they were stabbed in the back, to use the expression that was used at the time. What did it mean? Germany had a great army going into World War I and going into World War II also. And they believed, by all accounts, they should have won the war. So World War I, it should have been an easy operation, because the French, they figured, were worthless. So they already destroyed them in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. But things didn't quite turn out that way. And as you know, the Germans lost World War I. And when they lost the war, remember, there was a conference in Versailles Palace in France, outside of Paris. And the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war vis-a-vis Germany was a very harsh one, and created a lot of anger amongst the German people. And that only made things worse, because the stab in the back was actually an idea or a myth that was promulgated by the German military. They said, we couldn't have lost the war. The only way we could have lost the war is if we were stabbed in the back. If guys back home did us in, not the enemy, our own. Now, the expression stabbed in the back comes from a very important source in German folklore. I don't know if you're familiar with German mythology or Wagner operas, on which Wagner builds his operas on these myths. And there's the famous story of Siegfried. Siegfried was this invincible German warrior from the Middle Ages. And why was he invincible? Because he was told that if he immerses himself in a pond of blood, dragon blood, nothing can kill him. So he immerses himself into the dragon blood. It's just one thing. As he was about to completely go under, a wind came by and took a leaf off a tree, and the leaf landed on his back. And he didn't know that. So everything was covered with dragon blood except that little spot in his back. Needless to say, he went off to war and he was stabbed right there in the back, and that's how he died. When World War I ended and the Germans lost, they needed to blame it on somebody, needed a scapegoat. So they said, we were stabbed in the back, right? They took that notion from the famous story of Siegfried. I mean, every German knew that myth. And they applied it to certain groups. First and foremost, to Jews, which was an unmitigated lie. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the poetry part. But Jews fought in World War I for Germany in greater numbers, percentage-wise, than anyone else. They were of less than 1% of the total population, and yet they lined up and didn't even wait to be drafted. They just enlisted because they were very patriotic and they loved Germany. But someone had to be blamed. So the Jews were blamed first. The communists and socialists were blamed second. The pacifists were also, I mean, it was a whole group of people that were, tarred with this myth of the stab in the back. So getting back to this, when the Nazis came into power in 1933, it was January 1933, the first thing they did was they had a big book burning. All the books written by Jews, by anti-Nazis, by pacifists, by socialists, by communists, whatever, were all gathered together in a huge pile in Berlin and set on fire. And it obviously was a symbolic message. No one who's against this government or who doesn't fit the racial profile, they've been cut out of life in Germany. And this is the very beginning. It was the first night, 1933, when the Nazis came into power. Just as an aside, an ending aside, there was a very famous German writer in the 19th century, late 19th century, by the name of Heinrich Heine, famous German writer. And Heine was Jewish, but he converted, became a Protestant. But Heine wrote a play in 1870 called Almanzor. It was about the Spanish Inquisition. And in that play, Heine prophetically wrote, "There where they burn books, in the end they'll burn people." So you can imagine the connection, or, the illusion. I mean, obviously he had no idea that 50 or whatever, 60 years later, the Nazis were going to be in power, but interesting prophecy. So Erich Maria Remarque's books, and especially this one, were on that big pile that was, the pyre of the beginnings of the Nazi regime that burnt all of these books, and his book was prominent among them. Now, they wanted to arrest Remarque, the Nazis, because he, obviously was a traitor to the cause. He was also anti-Nazi, but he escaped to Switzerland. All right, that's why he ended up, he was in New York for a little while after the war, but he was in Switzerland basically for the rest of his life. And like I said, that's where he died, and that's where he's buried. And they wanted the Nazis to get him as a traitor, but they couldn't because he was out of the country. So what did they do? And so we can't get him, but he's got a sister. Remember the young sister, Elfriede? She's here still in Germany. So they arrested his sister, Elfriede, and brought her to trial. It was a joke. It was a kangaroo court. It was obviously, the whole thing was just a propaganda ploy. And she was found guilty in place of her brother, right? She'd done nothing. I mean, she was married, had children, was living there in Germany, but they couldn't get the brother. So they said, we can't get your brother, so we got you. And they condemned her to death. And they let her out, and only, I guess, Nazi style, yeah, never mind, they're killing an innocent woman for a crime she didn't do, and quite frankly, for a crime her brother didn't do. Being opposed to the government, I guess in Nazi Germany or any dictatorship, is a crime. But in the real world, in the just world, it's not a crime. But that's how they saw it. They couldn't get him, they got her. So she was found guilty. And what they did, let her out, and she was, it's like something out of the Middle Ages. How was she killed? She was decapitated. They cut her head off. And then they made her husband and the family pay for all of the costs involved in the court case. So that was Remarque's youngest sister, Elfrida. Remarque didn't learn of his sister's fate until after the war ended. And he dedicated another novel of his, the Funkeleben, the Spark of Life, to his murdered sister, Elfrida. And then, as I said, he died in Switzerland. He's written a number of other novels, but the one we're concerned with is the most famous one. Obviously, it's the one we're going to be looking at. Now, in 2018, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal, I don't know whether you read it or not, really incredibly, it's my favorite newspaper. It's no propaganda, no agenda, and it's not just a financial newspaper. Obviously, it's owned by, I think, by Dow Jones, but its financial sections obviously are considered the most respected and reliable of all. But it's not. It's news. The first part is news, and then there are cultural essays and so on about book reviews every day, another book, and what's going on in the art world and the sports world, and then of course all the op-ed pieces and so on. So in 2018, which of course marked the end, 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, someone wrote a piece. I don't know this guy, a writer and critic, lives in Gloucestershire, England. By the name of Gray, wrote this piece about the novel All Quiet on the Western Front. It's not that long, and it's really worth reading because not only his insight, but it'll clarify maybe a lot of things that were unclear when you read it. And he calls this piece an anti-war classic that knew no borders. So it's clearly an anti-war novel. You'll see exactly how the war and its participants are portrayed and the damage that the war has done. All right, so this is what he writes. The unprecedented nature of the trench warfare in World War I created a communal experience. As the French and British soldiers suffered from being sitting targets, so did the Germans. Erich Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, may have been written by a German from a German infantryman's perspective, but it captures all of the existential terror faced by the men who fought in the Great War. And it's true. It's from the perspective, obviously, of a German soldier. But it transcends one nation and has a universal humanistic message. No soldier outlives 1,000 chances, writes Remarque. That's in the mouth of his doomed hero, Paul Boehmer. But every soldier believes in chance and trusts his luck. And what he's saying is, you go off to war and most people are not going to come back. And every time you dodge the bullet, you used up one of your chances. fate has given you a break. But every soldier knows that the luck's going to run out at some point. All Quiet on the Western Front celebrates its 90th anniversary in January. That was 2 years ago. It's about a group of young men straight out of school whose first calling is the killing that war demands. Most of this killing is done at a distance and therefore has an abstract quality to it. The pivotal moment in All Quiet on the Western Front arrives about 3/4 of the way through when Paul Boehmer, the narrator, experiences hand-to-hand combat for the first and only time. Not long after he has taken refuge in a shell hole, a French soldier thinks to do the same thing. So what does Boehmer do, right? As an enemy soldier, he automatically lashes out with his little dagger and stabs the man 3 times in the throat. Stricken by remorse, for the quote, "For the first time I see that you are a man like me," end quote, Boehmer tries to staunch the bleeding, but to no avail. Eventually, the gurgling man dies. The scene is made unforgettable by Boehmer's emotional awakening when he rifles through the dead man's wallet and he discovers photographs and letters pertaining to his private life. Already in the novel, Boehmer has been tasked with guarding a camp full of Russian prisoners of war and sympathizes with their plight because it could just as easily have been his own. Quote, "Any non-commissioned officer is more of an enemy to a recruit, any schoolmaster to a pupil than they are to us," end quote. It was this sense of empathy for a putative enemy that made All Quiet on the Western Front such a revolutionary novel about war. It also scared the hell out of the Nazis, who immediately banned Remarque's novel when they came to power in 1933, destroying both it and its sequel, The Road Back. It's another World War I novel he wrote, in a book burning spree. Remarque, born in 1898, died in 1970, who himself had been removed from active duty after being wounded on the Western Front, was working as a sports writer when he wrote his most enduring novel. He had kept a notebook during his convalescence and recorded other men's stories as he heard them. In an interview, he explained his reason for writing All Quiet. Quote, "The shadow of war hung over us, especially when we tried to shut our minds to it. The very day this thought struck me, I put pen to paper without much in the way of prior thought," end quote. His narrative rang true for many veterans, not least Arthur Wien, the Australian who translated his novel, Investinish Snoyas, into English, and came up with the incredible title, All Quiet on the Western Front. By the way, the German Investinish Snoyas literally means in the West, nothing new. Or in English, he called it All Quiet on the Western Front. Why did he call it that? The last line in the novel, or near the last line, I haven't got it in front of me, is nothing new, Investinish Snoyas. What that refers to is, in 1914, when the war broke out, there was no internet, there was no television. And the only source of information was his newspaper. But the newspapers were censored by the government. So the only other possible way to get information about what was going on was there would be big chalkboards on buildings in town, and every day someone from the war ministry would chalk in what's going on. If anything major happened, they would say, this battle, whatever. Or it would say, as it said in the last line of this novel, Investinish Snoyas, nothing new on the Western Front. Right. So that's where the title comes from. Many critics were stunned by the initial success of his novel, Remarque's novel, which was sold over 50 million copies worldwide and was made into a landmark 1930 film by the Hollywood director Louis Milestone. We'll see it. They wondered how something so simply written could be so sought after and griped about the novel's bleakness. But as the American critic Harold Bloom has noted, Bloom is, I guess he's still around, has written a billion books. He was a professor of comparative literature at Yale. He said, no, it's not true. The seeming simplicity of Remarque's novel belies a strong sense of structural organization. It alternates light and dark episodes, increasing as the novel progresses. For the bookish Boehmer, Boehmer's the student who's sort of the spokesman for his schoolmates now that they're off at the war, but he's a very intelligent and he likes to read a lot, and he's something of a poet, all right? So for the bookish Boehmer, the finest thing that rose out of the war and could never be belittled was comradeship. Remark has a remarkable aptitude for sketching scenes of barracks life and extracurricular escapades. When Boehmer and the grizzled veteran Kaczynski go hunting for a goose to eat, it turns into a moment of slapstick straight out of the Keystone Cops. Remark sets out his intentions for All the Quiet on the Western Front in the beginning of the book. Quote, "The book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure for those who stand face to face with it." All right, I'm going to end here because that's where we're going to start with the intro to the novel. And what exactly does Remark mean? There's the book. Here it is. And is there an irony in the way he opens the novel? If you have it, this is my edition. This is the one I think that they have that they had in the bookstore, if you look at it that way. It's probably, it might actually be the only edition out there. But as was pointed out, this is 2 years ago, 50 million copies have been sold, and the book has been translated into just about every language in the world. So it begins, before the actual first chapter, there's a little intro or blurb on the first page before the novel starts. And I just want to read it. If you have it, hopefully you have the novel in front of you, you can read along. It's a very interesting intro. It says, "This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war." Very powerful intro. He says, this is not an accusation. It's very much an accusation. It's an accusation against a government that sends their youngest and most promising elements in society to go off and get killed for an idea they probably don't even know what they're fighting for. We sort of saw this in As Told by the Schoolmaster, remember Goldsworthy. It's very much an accusation. It's an accusation against governments that send youngsters off. It's an accusation against war, against the whole notion of war. Why? Because he said, even though they may have escaped shells, they were destroyed by the war. Maybe they survived. Maybe they weren't killed. But for the rest of their lives, that war will be with them. Either because of the shell shock we spoke about earlier on, or because the memories and the scenes that they were witness to and their comrades who died right next to them leaves an indelible impression. Your life's never going to be the same again. We spoke about this earlier, that a whole group, when I was speaking about Hemingway, of Americans became expatriates. This is the 1920s, right after the war ended, First World War ended, and they all ended up in Paris. And one of them, Gertrude Stein, writer herself, called them the lost generation. They were the lost generation because anyone who fought in World War I at a young age like this lost the normal flow of life from school, if you were inclined to go on to college and graduate school, if you chose a profession of some sort or some undertaking, you trained for it, and became knowledgeable and adept at what you decided you wanted to do with your life. You got married, you had a family, and life, sort of unfolded the way life is normally supposed to unfold. But if you were a soldier at a young age like this, it didn't happen. It was cut off. And the school and the further school or the profession or the whatever you were going to plan to train for a livelihood, get married, have a family, all of that was gone now. Even if you did survive, and if you did, let's say, get married and have a family, you were not the same person you would have been had you not had to experience war and the devastation of war and the loss of life. And obviously it scarred you forever. So it's very much an accusation, no matter what he says. But I think he's being sarcastic. So the story begins, as all stories do, right, on page 1, in chapter 1. And it begins, we are at rest 5 miles behind the front. Yesterday we were relieved, and now our bellies are full of beef and haricot beans. Right, so he's said it on the front, or just behind the front, and is being told from the perspective of this young soldier, Paul Boehmer, who, along with his school comrades, have gone off and joined this war. He introduces a number of people, especially this guy, Kaczynski. Kaczynski is an older fellow who's been around for a while, but becomes sort of like a father figure, especially to Boehmer. Because, like I said, these are kids. Now, in the movie version, it begins, like I said, in the classroom with teacher, older teacher, who is encouraging them all to go off to fight for the fatherland, right? And how important it is to give your life for Germany, for the fatherland, because he's a veteran, right? He fought in the Franco-Prussian War. And in a good humanistic education, like they used to have back when, or certainly in Europe, you'll notice on the blackboard in the movie all these things written in Greek and so on, because you've got to learn classical languages, Greek, Latin, or whatever. And there's a quote that this teacher uses from the Roman poet Horace. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's good and proper to die for one's country. By the way, that's going to be the title of a very important poem that we're going to look at from World War I. So he's encouraging them, and, he was appealing to their sense of patriotism, nationalism, and so on. And most of them, they're young and impressionable, and they go along with it. And then they're the ones who don't. But they get swept up anyway, because, it's like they call now peer pressure. Right? So he goes on, and this is page 10. This guy Kanturek, he'd been their schoolmaster. Kanturek had been our schoolmaster, a stern little man in a gray tailcoat with a face like a shrew mouse. He was about the same size as Corporal Himmelstoss, the terror of Klosterburg. Himmelstoss, you'll see, he's an absolutely obnoxious human being who takes pleasure in torturing these young recruits. Why? Because they're more intelligent than he is. Coming out of gymnasium, at least they have some educational background, and he's not all that bright. But the name is interesting also. In German, Himmelstoss, Himmel is heaven, and stossen is the verb to poke or push against. So that he's like one of these guys who's always like, in the right. He's like the holier than thou, always pushing towards heaven or whatever. It was very queer that the unhappiness of the world is so often brought on by small men. Well, interesting comment, and maybe prophetic also. He certainly, Remarque, knew about one little guy in history who had a profound impact, and that was Napoleon, a little guy, Napoleon. What he didn't know when he wrote this, you know what, I take it back, because he wrote this in 1928. You know what, he might very well have intended this. Who is the other little guy who impacted world history for the worse? It was Hitler. Even though Hitler kept talking about the Aryan ideal, the tall, blonde, blue-eyed, whatever, Hitler wasn't blonde, he wasn't blue-eyed, and he wasn't tall, right? So maybe he is sort of alluding to Hitler, because already in 1928, before 1928, Hitler and the Nazis were running around all over the place, waiting for their moment, right? That right after World War I, when Germany lost, the right wing and the nationalist parties and the figures like Hitler were intent on having their payback for what happened in World War I. So it could be very much so that when he talks about how little men sometimes have a big impact for the worse on the world, maybe he was alluding to Hitler. But in this case, he's also talking about this guy Himmelstadt, or Kantorek rather. They are so much more energetic and uncompromising than the big fellows. It's known, by the way, I think in psychology, the Napoleon complex. You have to overcompensate for your short stature by being loud and whatever. During drill time, Kantorek gave us long lectures until the whole of our class went under his shepherding to the district commandant and volunteered. So he kept giving them long lectures on patriotism and nationalism until finally they just all went along and signed up. I can see him now, as he used to glare at us through his spectacles and say in a moving voice, "Won't you join up, comrades?" Why do you think that their teacher, Kantorek, would address his students, kids, as comrades? What he's telling them subliminally is, hey, I'm a veteran, and we're all here to defend the fatherland, so we're all comrades. We're all in this together. We're one community. And so he's already told these kids, you're with us, you're part of us, you're one of the comrades, you're one of the soldiers, so now go off and fight. Another point, when World War I ended and the Germans lost, this was a devastating event, in particular for those soldiers who survived World War I in Germany, because they felt suddenly, they had no identity. Who are they? Their whole life, they were kids, right? So the whole life was fighting. That's all they knew was war and the camaraderie of their fellow soldiers. Now the war's over and they lost and they came back to a devastated, defeated country, and they're no longer together with all of their buddies from the war, and they were lost. You know what came out of that? A term in German known as die Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the people. Now, what it meant for the Nazis was Aryans. We're all one Aryan community, eine Gemeinschaft. For the soldiers that came out of World War I, they had their own separate Gemeinschaft because they were lost and no one could relate to them. So they kind of stuck together and they became the Sturmabteilung, the SA, Hitler's protective paramilitary organization. He appealed to them because he told them, you didn't lose the war, you were stabbed in the back, you're important, and I recognize how important you are, and I'm going to give you a meaning in life. Now we're going to have a real meaning in your life because you're going to join with me, and we are going to take over, and we are going to have our revenge for what was done in World War I, and Germany will once again be the great power that it was before. So one of the themes, actually, I should tell you in the beginning, actually, what are the main themes that come out of this novel? Well, this is the first one. The notion of nationalism, the notion of camaraderie, of comradeship, the notion of the meaningless loss of life, the idea that, at least in the case of Paul, and I guess Paul as the spokesman, of the universal humanity that makes all people the same. We're all flesh and blood. If you believe, we're all possessing a soul, right? I'm sure I've mentioned in the past the famous Christmas Day truce, where both sides suddenly stopped shooting each other and decided to play soccer and exchange gifts. That recognition that, you know, we might speak a different language, we might come from a different country, but we're all kids, basically. We're all young, and we're all here fighting a war that means nothing to us because we have no idea what it's all about. And in that scene that he mentions in the op-ed piece that I read to you, what happened was Boimler finds himself, like I said, in a pit, in a dugout, and all of a sudden there's a Frenchman, his enemy, coming into the same hole in the ground, and he panics. After all, it's the enemy, so he takes out a knife and he stabs him 1, 2, 3 times in the neck. Then realizes, oh my God, I've just killed someone. And he tries to staunch the bleeding, stop it, and save his life, but he can't. It's very poignant in the movie, you'll see. And then he starts apologizing to this dead French soldier. He's like, I'm sorry, what did I do? What did I do? And then he starts looking through the guy's pocket, and there's a picture of his wife and his daughter. And then he realized, you know what? I killed another human being. I've never even dreamt of doing something like this before. And not only another human being, this is a man who has a wife and he has a daughter, and I've killed him. And then he tells the dead body of the French, I'm gonna get these pictures back to your wife when this war is over, and I'm gonna apologize for what I did, and so on and so forth. So this basically what Remarque is saying is that these kids that are fighting, who don't even know what they're fighting about, have now come face to face with the fact that war means death. It means killing someone else, taking another human life. And in this case, the recognition that, you know, everyone's blood is just as red. You know, the government's telling you this is the enemy, go out and kill him. But on a one-to-one basis, you realize you're killing another human being, right? So in any case, this teacher of theirs is, you know, pushing them off to fight, calling them comrades and so on. These teachers always carry their feelings ready in their waistcoat pockets and trot them out by the hour. But we didn't think of that then. In other words, we're saying, yeah, at the time we're listening to all of this, yeah, we fell under the spell of it. What he meant by we didn't think of it then is, you know what, we weren't smart enough or mature enough or intelligent enough to realize maybe what they're telling us is wrong. Maybe we should be thinking before we actually act. There was indeed one of us who hesitated and didn't want to fall into line. That was Joseph Bain, a plump, homely fellow, but he did allow himself to be persuaded, otherwise he would have been ostracized. Peer pressure. And perhaps more of us thought as he did, but no one could very well stand out, because at that time, even one's parents were ready with the word coward. No one had the vaguest idea what we were in for, right? There was war fever. There was extreme patriotism, nationalism, you know, anger at the enemy, the supposed enemy, whatever. He said even the parents were averse to telling their children, their sons, not to go off to war because you were a coward, right? Everyone expected you to go off and fight. But we had no idea what we were in for. The wisest were just the poor and simple people. They knew the war to be a misfortune, whereas those who were better off and should have been able to see more clearly what the consequences would be were beside themselves with joy. It's almost Tolstoyan. Leo Tolstoy, the Russian writer, always said that the peasants, the simple, uneducated individuals, they're closer to the truth. They're not sophisticated, they're not educated, they're not complex, but they know the truth. And that's what he's saying. The ones who knew the truth here, the ones who really understood what war was all about, were the simple people, right? But the ones who should have known better, the ones who were educated, who were knowledgeable, who were sophisticated, they didn't tell us what war is all about, what we're going to encounter. They're the ones who should have. So what he's saying is, here we are, young kids. We've been manipulated, and we've been basically indoctrinated, and now we're going to go off, but we didn't even know what the heck we're in for, right? War was something, either they read about it in poems or books and it was glorified, but actually to be there, to experience war firsthand, the brutality, the loss of life, the bloodshed, the suffering, so, that they didn't tell us about. But they're going to find out about it in the course of this novel. We turn to the next page, page 12. For us lads of 18, they ought to have been mediators and guides to the world of maturity, the world of work and duty, of culture, of progress, to the future. We often made fun of them and played jokes on them, but in our hearts we trusted them. The idea of authority, which they represented, was associated in our minds with a greater insight and more humane wisdom. But the first death we saw shattered this belief. We had to recognize that our generation was more to be trusted than theirs. One of the consequences of World War I and its end was the total rejection of everything that generation had believed to be true and authoritative. You can imagine, especially in Germany, but it's probably true everywhere, but especially in Germany, what was education like? You sat in the classroom, your teacher stood in front of you. Whatever he said was oracular. It was like Moses on Sinai, right? Whatever the teacher said, that's the truth. He's the teacher. He's a figure of authority. And in Germany, authority is a big deal. So you believe him. You don't question him. He's telling you the truth. And what is he telling you? He's reading you all of the classics of German culture, the literary classics, the historical writings, and the great figures that populate German history, all the great warriors, all the great emperors. Who questions that? You can't question that. It's your teacher. You have tremendous respect for your teacher. So you believe it, you accept it, you don't question it. He said, but after the war was over, those of us who survived, or those who did survive, weren't so fast anymore. In fact, quite the contrary. They realized we'd just been told, a whole batch of lies. This is going to show up culturally in a very interesting way when we talk about the art of World War I. After World War I ended, like I said, all these survivors or whatever suddenly distrusted everyone and everything. And so a movement arose in art known as Dada, D-A-D-A. And we're going to talk about it, so I don't want to go into, but basically it was rejection of all the traditional notions one had about art, because one rejected the notions that one had about everything after World War I. Like I said, you can't trust them anymore. So Dada was the anti-art movement. And what it did is produce everything that would have been considered junk or garbage or whatever before, instead of classical notions of painting and so on. And that became art. Why? Because it was a way of showing the rejection of everything that they believed in until now, because now they realized it was all a lie. We were sent off to fight in some ridiculous war we shouldn't have fought to begin with. There was no reason for a war, and all of our friends and colleagues and comrades, they're all dead, right, as a result of this. So he said, we were all, our eyes were opened when the war ended and all our beliefs were shattered. And the next page, while they, the guys in charge, the figures of authority, while they continued to write and talk, we saw the wounded and the dying. While they taught that duty to one's country is the greatest thing, we already knew that death throes are stronger. But for all that, we were no mutineers, no deserters, and no cowards. They were very free with all these expressions. We loved our country as much as they. We went courageously into every action, but also we distinguished the false from true. We had suddenly learned to see, and we saw that there was nothing of their world left. We were all at once terribly alone, and alone we must see it through. when you realize that all of the things you've been taught and believed in, all of the figures of authority that you trusted, it was all a lie, you feel really much, you feel alone. And that's how they felt when they went off to war and saw what the reality was. I have also have a PhD in German literature, and specifically the literature of the Weimar Republic, which is the period after World War I. And one of the themes that keeps reappearing and reappearing in German literature is the revolt of the fathers and the sons rebelling against the fathers, because they realized that generation, their father's generation, the one they trusted and the one that they believed in, ended up, spouting lies and untruths. And what was the consequence, right? A war that devastated a whole generation. So the setting is already there. These are kids, their age, about 18. They've been basically talked into going off to war without any notion of what war is all about. And as the novel goes on, one after another of these comrades from that class are going to die or be killed, one after another, until the only one left is the chronicler, Paul. And Paul is going to, of course, die at the end as well. Unfortunately, he's going to die right about the time the war ends. And we're going to see that in a number of poems where actually the poet died a week before the war ended. And if you recall, just a few days ago, Farewell to Arms, very poignant scene at the end of that movie. Why the church bells ringing? To announce the end of the war. The war is over, but the impact isn't. And one of those symbolic figures of the war is Catherine Barclay and her unborn or stillborn son. They're dead. The war is over, but the legacy goes on. So at the end of this first chapter, yes, that's the way they think. These 100,000 cantorics, this teacher. Iron youth, we are none of us more than 20 years old. But young youth, that is long ago. We are old folk. Meaning what? When they went off to war, their youth ended. And what they saw and experienced in the war aged them beyond their chronological years, right? Youth is gone. We're not youth anymore. My chronologically would be now 21, 22, 23, but we're old because the experience has taken away our youth and defined our lives. Now looking at chapter 2, it's strange to think at home in the drawer of my writing table, there lies the beginning of a play called Saul and a bundle of poems. All right, so he was a teenager, but already with a sort of literary bent, and he was writing, poems and a play or whatever, probably very simple and unsophisticated, but he was a kid. But we see his character. He was a very sensitive person and literary minded, and obviously someone who had a sort of scholarly bent. But now I can't believe all those things are back home in a drawer because that life is over now. Many an evening I've worked over them. We all did something of the kind, but that has become so unreal to me. I cannot comprehend it anymore. Our early life is cut from the moment we came here, and that without our lifting a hand. We often try to look back on it and to find an explanation, but never quite succeed. For us young men of 20s, everything is extraordinarily vague. For Kropp, Müller, Lehr, and for me, the school comrades. For all of us, whom Kantarek calls the iron youth. All the older men are linked up with their previous life. They have wives, children, occupations, interests. They have a background which is so strong that the war cannot obliterate it. We young men of 20, however, have only our parents and some perhaps a girlfriend. That's not much. For at our age, the influence of parents is at its weakest, and girls have not yet got a hold over us. Besides this, There was little else. Some enthusiasm, a few hobbies, and our school. And beyond this, our life did not extend. And of this, nothing remains, right? Our youth ended, and we're sort of left dangling. Nothing remains, right? Because this war intervened and cut off, not only cut off, it obliterated everything that was our life before, and didn't prepare, and now we're not prepared for going forward, right? That lost generation. Kantorek would say that we stood on the threshold of life, and so it would seem. We had as yet taken no root. The war swept us away. For the others, the older men, it is but an interruption. They're able to think beyond it because they had a past. They reached a certain point of progression, and so they could come back to it. But for the young, there's nothing to come back to. And they hadn't reached or progressed to the point where they were prepared to move on in life, and now there's no preparation. Says further, we have lost all sense of other considerations because they are artificial. Only the facts are real and important to us, and good boots are scarce. All right. Now, this is the lead in to a really, all right, I hope you've read most of this. Why are boots, good boots, so scarce? Why is that the big concern? Previously, they had intellectual interests or hobbies or literary pursuit, whatever. Forget it. Now you're in a war, and you have to deal with the reality of war and the practicality of war. And if you're going to be marching around all over the place, you got to have a good pair of boots. Right? It's a lot of marching, and the marching on a lot of very difficult terrain. And if you have gone through the soles of your boots or whatever, it makes it so much more difficult. So now all of the esoteric things like poems and drama, forget it. You need a good pair of boots. So what happens with respect to that good pair of boots? It's one of the most poignant events in the whole novel, and you'll see it in the movie. One of their comrades, one of these students, a guy by the name of Kemmerich, he's been seriously wounded. So they go to see him in the army hospital and realize that he's had a leg amputated. But he himself doesn't know that his leg has been amputated. And they're standing there, and all of a sudden, he starts complaining that he has a pain in his leg. And one of the other guys, not too bright, but said, "What do you mean you have pain? You haven't got a leg." And then he realizes he's had his leg amputated. He didn't know, and he gets hysterical. And he realizes also he's dying. I guess the amputated probably was gangrenous and probably spread. He's going to die anyway very shortly. But the same schoolmate of his notices a really beautiful pair of boots next to the bed. And he very, insensitively asks them, basically, "Can I have your boots? You don't need them anymore." And, a good pair of boots, like I said, it's a big deal. Of course, when he's chewed out for that by Paul, he said, I'm sorry, but, he's going to die. And anyways, even if he hasn't got two legs anymore, why should they go? Someone will take them. And I could use them. We have to go off now and fight further, on the front, whatever. So the point is that in a very short time, these kids have been turned into really, I would say, cold-blooded or insensitive human beings, because that's what war does. It's live or, or die. It's me or the next guy. And there's a certain impulse in human beings that wants to preserve life. It's the life force. the élan vital, as the philosopher, French philosopher, what was his name again, called it, Henri Bergson. So that's what happens when you're in the middle of a war. All you think is, I want to live, and it's not like you're a miserable person. It's just, I guess, a normal response. So what Remarque is saying through the mouth of Paul Boehmer is, all that matters now are a good pair of boots, meaning anything necessary to sustain life or make it easier on the front. Once it was different. When we went to the district commandant to enlist, we were a class of 20 young men, many of whom proudly shaved for the first time before going to the barracks. We had no definite plans for our future. Our thoughts of a career and occupation were as yet of too unpractical a character to furnish any scheme of life. We were still crammed full of vague ideas which gave to life and to the war also an ideal and an almost romantic character, right? They're still naive enough to think of war as a sort of romantic experience, as is portrayed in all these other novels and poems they read. We were trained in the army for 10 weeks, and in this time, more profoundly influenced than by 10 years at school. We learned that a bright button is weightier than 4 volumes of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, famous German philosopher. It's interesting he chose Schopenhauer, who was a very pessimistic figure. But he's saying, look, you know what? Now you're in the army, and you have to have a nice shiny button on your uniform, and that's more important than all the Schopenhauer and all the philosophy that you ever learned, because your commanding officer probably never read Schopenhauer, could care less. In fact, he hates you because you're educated. So it's a new reality. We recognize that what matters is not the mind, but the boot brush, not intelligence, but the system, not freedom, but drill. In other words, what becomes of the soldier when the young guy first gets there? He's indoctrinated. He's transformed into a killing machine. Everything he was before, any sensitivity he had, any moral compunction, forget it. You're in the army now. And all the schooling you had, forget it. We don't want to hear about it. It isn't going to help you. We hate you for it. All that matters is what we drill into you, right? From now on, you're a soldier. You had no previous life. Your life begins now, and it's what we tell you it is. It's very interesting, just as an aside, but as an important aside. One of the most important figures in German history was a guy by the name of Martin Luther. I'm sure you've heard the name, and you've heard the eponymous religion, Lutheranism. What was Martin Luther all about? Martin Luther came up with his brand of Protestantism. He broke from the Catholic Church. And basically, without going into the whole philosophy of his new religious beliefs, there were 2 things that stand out in Luther. One, he was a brutal anti-Semite. He didn't start out that way because he thought all the Jews would convert and become Lutherans. When they didn't, then he turned on them and wrote some really horrible tractates, which the Nazis quoted, very often and with great pleasure. And Luther believed that a human being has to know one thing. You only answer to God and to the state. Those are the 2 authorities. You don't question them. You don't contradict them. You don't go against them. That's what you have to do. So many have suggested that since Lutheranism was the dominant religion in Germany, and because Luther's extreme nationalism and his demand that you answer to only 2 authorities, God and the state, and add to that his anti-Semitism and racial doctrines and so on, they said, well, that explains what happened in 1933, basically when the Nazis came into power. But this notion of all that matters is the drill, you're a soldier, you have no other thoughts, you don't have a past, you don't have a family, you don't have anything. All you have is what your commanding officer tells you. And that's your life from now on. So you basically had your identity stripped away, and now you are an automaton under the control of your COO, your commanding officer. So this is the beginning, and this is the sort of indoctrination, first in school, now in training, and so on and so forth. And slowly, these individuals, these youngsters, come to the realization that they are creatures of an order, a new order, a military order, and that means just following orders. It also means that they're going to experience untold brutality, the horrors of war, the death of their comrades, and very often a lack of food. Right? There are going to be instances where suddenly, because of their situation or the position or whatever, they have to go without food for lengthy periods of time. Not only that, remember, this is the Western Front. It's early on, and trench warfare, as we discussed, characterizes or basically is the model for what went on. And what goes on in these trenches is, as we know, pretty horrific. Well, they're going to suffer all of this. And it's very striking in the movie because it's visual. You'll see it. Every time a projectile or bomb lands somewhere or other, either in the trench or near the trench, and everything starts rattling and shaking, and all the, the ceiling starts collapsing, everything else, some of these soldiers are going to lose it. They're going to become totally unhinged out of fear, shell shock. And in one really moving scene, one of them just can't take it anymore, starts running out of the trench and into no man's land. And all of a sudden, he is blinded, can't see. And so he's running around like a chicken without a head, as they say, hysterical because he's lost his sight, but also unable to see where he's going. Needless to say, his end is imminent. It's going to happen very shortly. And then there's something else. We spoke about the conditions in the trenches on no man's land, about the horrible profusion of mice and rats the size of cats and dogs. So all of a sudden, when these rats sense or smell food in the trench, they want it. And there's going to be a scene in the movie that also is just unbearable, with just throngs and throngs of rats suddenly descending into the trench, trying to get at the bread, and the attempts to kill them, taking everything you got, a shovel or whatever, just beating them over the head, but they're all over the place, right? So remember, these are kids, and prior to this, they had nice, stable, comfortable, and predictable lives. Now, all of a sudden, their wildest imaginations couldn't have conjured up what they're going to experience on the front. Which brings us to chapter 3. All right, so all right, maybe we'll stop. We'll go on with this the next time. So please read from chapter 3 on, and that's where we meet the figure of Kaczynski, who is sort of, like I said, a father figure, especially to Paul, because he's been around for a while, and he knows the ropes, and they're going to depend on him. Needless to say, at some point, he too is going to be killed, right? And then poor Paul is really alone. But we'll get to that the next time. All right. I haven't looked yet today, but as of yesterday, a number of you sent me your paper topics, for which I really thank you. And like I said, it will add to your grade. And someone asked also about the due date. Again, the papers we do the day of the final exam. I'm not sure when it is yet because they haven't posted the final exam schedule here, but I know for my class in Baruch, it's like the middle of December. So figure on the middle of December, but I also have kind of a week to hand the grades in. So sort of focus on getting it to me the day of the final exam. If you need a few more days, I guess I can give you that leeway because the grades don't have to be in right away. But don't sort of rely on that. If you find at the end you need it, fine. But I think try and have everything ready by the date of the final exam. And I hope I have that information for you also next time, it's third when we meet. Now, one other point someone asked about the list of paper topics. I believe also has an intro that says how long it has to be, about 10 to 12 pages, double spaced, bibliography, footnotes. So maybe you haven't had an experience yet writing a term paper and putting footnotes and bibliography. You know what? The best way to do that is, I haven't got it in front of me. Take the textbook that we're using, or any history. It's going to have footnotes, and it's going to have bibliography. Use that as a model. Now, when do you footnote something? You footnote something when you are taking it directly from another source, right? Or if you are talking about something, you don't want to go to great length in the text itself, so you might want to footnote it just to sort of summarize what your point is. And like I said, every book that you're using has footnotes in it, so you can use that model. Or you can use the Chicago style sheet or the MLA manual. I mean, the different manuals that tell you how to do all of this, but you know what? The easiest and simplest way to do it is just to use the format for footnotes and bibliography that you find in all the books you're reading. What else I want to mention? When you've chosen a topic and doing the research on it, focus on exactly what your point is going to be, so you don't meander all over the place. I mean, sort of have an introductory thesis line. You know, this is what I'm talking about. This is basically what I'm about to show you and prove, right? So you're focused, and the person reading it is focused, and you know where you're going, instead of just, you know, going aimlessly from one point to another. And last but not least, I encourage you, you don't have to, if you want me to look over a draft before you finalize it, email me the draft and I'll read it and I'll make comments and get back to you right away. Normally, if we were in a class, this would be a lot easier, but I guess we have to deal with the circumstances as they are. So anytime you have a question, or at any point where you want me to read what you've written and make suggestions, you know, until it's finally handed in at the end, you can, you know, ask and I will guide you, and you can make all the changes that I suggest. If you're having a problem finding bibliography, that really shouldn't be much of a problem, because once you have one book on a subject, you can find a million other books by looking at the bibliography in the back, right? So it shouldn't be a problem. Plus, the bibliography that's attached to the syllabus is pretty lengthy, so probably find things there as well. So last but not least, you know, I'm not a big fan of going online or whatever. So I had this discussion with my daughters, right? They are long out of college, out of grad school. Well, youngest one's still in grad school. And I guess I'm a generation behind, because I said, well, how are they supposed to do this? You know, the library's closed. And they both looked at me like I fell out of a tree. What are you talking about? You can go online, not only find the source, you can get the whole source online, get the whole book online, either from the library or from the public library or whatever. So there should be no problem getting source material. And there's also a thing called JSTOR, J-S-T-O-R, where you can actually get full-length journal articles or whatever and download them. So notwithstanding the difficulties outside, there should be no obstacle to getting the necessary sources to write the paper. But again, I'm happy to look over and make comments anytime you want to send me a draft. Any questions so far about All Quiet on the Western Front or final paper or anything? Again, feel free to email me, but really try and read and have the text in front of you. Yeah, question.
What type of finals are you looking to give? Sorry.
Okay. So the final exam is going to be basically the same format as the midterm. It's going to cover only from the midterm on. You'll have to answer 4 out of 5 essays or 3 out of 5 essays and identify 5 out of 6, whatever, on the identification. Exact same format, but it only covers from the midterm on. So basically, off the top of my head, what do we do from the midterm on? Well, we talked about the war in the Middle East, and I think we talked about the end of the war and the 14 points. And then there's all the literature that we're going to read and all of the artwork that we're going to look at.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So stay safe, stay well. See you on Thursday. Take care.